That revival come.
Hey!
Revival come.
The church in Enugu is not different from the church in Kano, because the church in Enugu and Kano all look like God. But when the church in Kano begin to resemble the culture and the tradition of those of the north, it ceases to be a church. When the church in Enugu begins to look like the culture and the traditions of your ancestors, no matter the religious rituals we carry out, it's no longer a church, it's a cult. Listen, what I'm talking about is not even among men only, even in the realm of spirits. The same way the 4 beasts cannot look like any other angels, the same way the 24 elders cannot look like any other angel. That's how the church too cannot look like anything else apart from God. So even in the realm of the spirit, the church was called out to represent God and God alone. The reason we are superior to the angels in ranking is because in the angelic cadre, there are some angels that mirror the dimension of light. Meanwhile, light is only one dimension in God. So when you see those angels, their power is in their intensity and their illumination. There are angels that mirror the dimension of fire. They are called the seraphims. When you see those angels, their power is in the degree of their intensity. But when you meet the church, the only thing you should see is not light, it's not fire, it's the fullness of Christ. This is why we are superior to the angelic. You know, David could not understand it because he was in a dispensation when the church had not entered his full element. And when he looked into the divine cadre, he saw God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And then he was hoping to see the 24 elders, and suddenly he saw man. And he now came to earth and said, what is man? What? He didn't say who is man, because if you say who is man, you are talking about mortals. Because what he saw included God, man, angels, and demons. And all of a sudden he saw that immediately after Elohim, Psalm 8 verse 4, he saw man, and then he saw angels. He now said, wait, I thought when you are comparing man, you will compare men with men. So I can come to you and say, my father is the president, so I'm bigger than you. He now said the comparison of man is not just with man. In fact, the Bible says they that compare themselves with themselves are not wise. So the comparison of man is not with man. The comparison of man is with God, angels, and demons. And when he checked the divine cadre, he saw that only God was superior to man. He now said, what is man? Man is the church. And I will show you. Because man is the house of God. The Bible said in 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 27, God himself was talking. God said, where will you make my house for me? He said, the heaven, even the heaven of heavens cannot contain me. And he said, the earth is my footstool. So in all of the universes of God, nothing could carry God. Do you know the throne of God is in heaven, but the fullness of God is not in heaven? Remember, the Bible said all things consist in God. So even heaven is in God. So the fullness of heaven is not in the fullness of God is not in heaven. Now, how does God come into heaven? I want to show you. I told you it's definition of terms, so we will understand what I'm trying to deal with. That's why I'm calm. The fullness of God cannot be in heaven. God himself said it. And he said the whole earth is his foot, not feet, his footstool. So one of God's foot covers the whole earth. So how does God come into heaven? If you read Revelation chapter 5 The Bible said God is covered with crystals, jasper, sardine. Now, crystals, we understand from the law of physics that crystals reflect and refract. So when you look at a diamond, if you hold a diamond crystal in the dark and there is light somewhere, as you turn that diamond, the crystal of the diamond will absorb that light and refract it. So you see diamonds shining. That's what happens in heaven. This is why the 24 elders keep looking at God. They keep looking, because every time they look up, another dimension of God refracts into heaven. If they look up, another dimension refracts. They have never seen the fullness of God, because the fullness of God cannot enter heaven. If God enters heaven, heaven will dematerialize. He said he dwells in light that is unapproachable. Where God dwells, nothing can get there. If you get there, you will dematerialize. So what God does is that in order for God to rule in heaven, he allows different dimensions of himself to come into heaven per time. That's the significance of the east gate. The east gate is the gate from whence the presence enters the temple. So in heaven, the throne of God by the sides of the north opens into the east gate. So when the angels look up, because God is clothed with crystals, a dimension will refract, and then they'll look at it and they think they have seen God. And then when they want to sit down, another dimension, and they'll say, we have been here for 10 million years, we've never seen this dimension. The reason is because the fullness of God can't enter heaven. So the only infrastructure that was created to host God Can I tell you what the throne room is about? The throne room is not just the administrative headquarters of heaven. The throne room is actually the school of God, because they cannot contain the whole of God. God decided to have a throne room where ranking princes in heaven can come and learn God. But when it came to man, he didn't want man to see fire today, see light tomorrow, see coldness, see, no, he tabernacled in man. Do you see why? If you don't look like God, you are not the church. The church in Germany is not different from the church in Africa. The only reason the church in Germany will be different from the church in Africa is because the church in Germany will look like Germans. The day the church in Germany looks like Christ and the church in Africa looks like Christ, it becomes one. Because that is the design. Now, for this to happen, please sit down. Tonight is a calm night. I'm just trying to escort you somewhere so that you will see the kind of Christianity they gave us. We come to teach people principles. People who are dominated by mammon. And then we teach them principle. We think by principle they can carry out divine biddings. As beautiful as the principles of prosperity is, as beautiful as the principle of honor is, meanwhile, many people use it to deify themselves. So when a man wants you to fear him and respect him, he will teach about honor for 1 year. When a man wants you to give to him, he will teach about prosperity for 1 year. So it is still the nature of the serpent that is using God to achieve the desires of the serpent. Now, these things are godly, they are of God. I'm not talking down on them. But these are realities that should flow out of us naturally when we become the church. When God wanted to institute the church, this one that Paul spoke about, in Ephesians 1 verse 4. There was nothing he could do. So he decided to create a universe. And when he created the visible universe, you know, when God wanted to create the seraphims, he brought out fire. It was fire he used to create them. So the seraphims are purified by walking to and fro in the midst of the coals of fire, because their essence is fire. There are many angels that God created with light. There are angels God created with sound. But when God wanted to create a species that will be separate, not only from other species in the natural, but also in the spirit, fire was not sufficient. Light was not sufficient. So God began to meditate. How do I create this species? So God had to return to the highest court of Zion, the court of the Godhead. And the Father, the Son, and the Spirit began to interact with themselves. Because the wisdom that created the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven was not enough to capture this new project God was embarking on. So God had to leave the third heaven, leave the second heaven, leave the third heaven, and came back into the studio of God, where creation is possible. It was in that studio that the Father spoke to the Logos, and the Logos spoke to the Spirit, and they said, let us make man. Now, what is the wisdom? We can't make man from fire. If we make man from fire, he will be a seraphim. We can't make man from light. We can't make man from sound. Everything we know, we have already used. What else are we going to use to make man? Because there was no other infrastructure for making man. The only raw material that was left to create man was God himself. So the raw material for making man is God. And the finished product is still God, because you can't improve on God. That was where the journey of the church began. The church didn't begin in the wilderness. The first church actually began in Eden. Because that was where God wanted to create a species that was separate, that was holy. And there were 5 things in Eden that defined that church. The first thing that defined the church of Eden is that the church of Eden had God's image. So when you look at the man that was separate, the only thing he resembles was God. Number 2, the church in Eden had God's likeness. That means that man only did what God did. If you see that man laughing, it's because God laughs. Everything God created, that man was following suit. When God created a woman, the man was sleeping. When the man woke up, he said, you are a woman. He didn't need to think, because he was functioning at the frequency of God. Being God's likeness means functioning at the frequency of God. You know, today, when you act like God, because the church has died, they say you are a magician. When Jesus came back to restore the church, he didn't say pray for the sick. He said touch the sick, because when you touch the sick, God touched the sick. That's what it means to be in God's likeness. Because the church is no longer what it is. The things that should be commonplace is what we now use as an instrument of merchandising people. When you come to the real church, they don't need to call the pastor to pray for the sick. Anybody that meets the sick will heal the sick. They don't need a prophet to prophesy. Anybody you meet will tell you the mind of God. But the real church is what we are fighting to recover. Because the church we have today is a church where few men know the way of God. The rest only know the acts of God. So men who should be carriers of God are clapping and wondering when God is manifesting. The things that should happen in your bedroom, you now see them and you are wondering. How come you are amazed when you see yourself? If you see yourself in the mirror, are you surprised? The reason is because it's been long you touched God. It's been long you saw God. It's been long you interacted with God. So when you see a man display God, you are in bewilderment. Meanwhile, the one God Jesus started, when they came back and told him they healed the sick, Jesus didn't testify. When they told him we healed the sick, he said, don't rejoice that you cast out demons, because the inheritance of the church is to cast out demons. They said demons were subject to us. He said, yes, that's good, but that's not why we celebrate. The reason we celebrate is because our name is in heaven. So the second criteria of the Edenic church is a church that carries the likeness of God. So that church doesn't prepare for a meeting. He's a prepared man. That church doesn't prepare to pray for the sick. Anywhere he sees the sick, whether it is in a healing service or in a market, he will pray and the sick will be healed. That church doesn't need to do a religious rigor in order to bet God. He is God expressed in human form. He is the likeness of God. And the third thing about the church in Eden is that that church is powered by the life of God. Genesis 2:9, it says God planted the tree of life in Eden. The fourth thing about the church in Eden is that that church had the presence of God. So the church of Eden was not living under a big cathedral. The church in Eden was living under the canopy of the presence. Our cathedral is good, yes, but when the presence of God departs, the cathedral becomes a monument. Because the house of the church is not a building. The house of the church is the presence of God. And the fifth thing about the church in Eden is that the church in Eden had the authority of God. It had the life of the image of God, the likeness of God, the presence of God, the life of God, and the authority of God. You know, that church was about to manifest when the devil truncated it, the way he always truncates the church. So that church had the presence, had the authority, had the image, had the likeness, but it never had the life. Before that church could eat of the tree of life, the devil knew there was problem. So the devil came and truncated it. So when the church was to be reborn, the Bible now tells us in Matthew chapter 16 verse 18, it said, upon this revelation I will build my church. Remember, there were many churches that time. There was a big synagogue that had 70 elders called the Sanhedrin. The cabinet of Rome was also called the Ecclesia. So there were many called out people. But Jesus was telling them that my own church, which is the pattern I wanted to create in Eden, it has its own blueprint. The blueprint is that it must have what? The image of God, the likeness of God, the life of God, the presence of God, and the authority of God. And unfortunately, in the whole universe, that was not found anywhere. Because the first time you had that, God had to come down from heaven and plant it. Eden was not on earth. Eden was in heaven. If you read Ezekiel chapter 28 from verse 13, it said you were in Eden, the mountain of God. So Eden is actually not a garden. Eden is the mountain of God. So God downloaded that mountain from heaven to earth. And that's why Eden was the presence of God. And then the image, Adam didn't know how to have the image. God gave it to him. He didn't know the likeness. God gave it. He was created like that. He didn't know the law of authority. God gave it to him. So there was no way you could have those qualities on earth, because the first time that quality came to earth, God planted it himself. So when God wanted to replant that same dimension on earth, the only possible way to achieve it was to bring the man that carried the five. So Jesus was the image of God, the likeness of God, the presence of God, the authority of God, and the life of God. So when Peter discerned him that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, immediately he said, on this revelation, because for the first time somebody has discovered what God came to earth with to establish the first church. What God came to earth with to establish the first church, which is his image, his likeness, his life, his presence, and his authority. Somebody for the first time had discerned it. The other people called him a prophet. Others called him Elias. Others called him Jeremiah. As powerful Elijah is, the church can't be built on him. Because Elijah had the authority of God, but he didn't have the image of God.
That revival come.
Hey!
Revival come. Revival come.